Imagine standing at the edge of a silent shore, the waves lapping softly, carrying whispers older than any book, older than any city. What if the oceans have been holding on to a memory of a world before our history began? Tonight, we will drift into the depths, slowly, gently, uncovering the quiet evidence that the seas may have witnessed civilizations long forgotten, their stories dissolved in salt and time. In the heart of nearly every Roman city, there was a place where time seemed to slow, voices softened, and the cares of the day dissolved into water and steam. These were the Thermae, the great public baths of Rome, not merely places to wash, but spaces for conversation, relaxation, and the gentle ritual of caring for the body. The Roman bath was, in its way, a masterpiece of harmony between architecture and human comfort. Stepping into one was like crossing into another world. Outside, the streets might be busy, carts rattling over stone, merchants calling to passers-by, and children darting between market stalls. But within the baths the air was warm and heavy, carrying the scent of heated stone and faint traces of oil and herbs. The soundscape softened to the quiet splash of water, the low murmur of voices, and the occasional clink of a strigil being set down. For the Romans, bathing was a social affair as much as a physical necessity. Friends met here daily, senators, and common citizens alike, each moving through the sequence of rooms designed to ease the body from tension into rest. The journey might begin in the appetitorium, a changing hall where clothes were stored in niches. Here, conversations began discussions of politics, business deals, or idle gossip about the latest games at the amphitheater Dot. From there, the bather would step into the tepidarum, the warm room. Its air was comfortably heated, the temperature, inviting the muscles to loosen. Marble benches lined the walls, and the floors radiated gentle warmth from the hypocaust system below, a marvel of Roman engineering that circulated hot air beneath the stone, keeping the space evenly tempered. Next came the caldereum, the hot room. Here the air shimmered faintly with heat, and steam rose from a large basin. Sitting in the caldereum was like wrapping oneself in the embrace of summer, even in the heart of winter. Sweat would bead on the skin, drawing out the dust and fatigue of the day. Some bathers would use a strigil, a curved metal tool, to scrape away the perspiration before an attendant massaged the skin with olive oil scented with rosemary or myrtle. Afterward came the shock of the frigidarium, the cold room. This plunge into cool water was both bracing and invigorating, a sharp reminder of the body's vitality. Gasps and laughter often accompanied the first moments in the frigidarium, but soon the coolness became a relief, sealing in the warmth. Gathered earlier, dot beyond the bathing itself, the Thermae offered gardens, exercise courtyards, reading rooms, and shaded porticos where one could sit in quiet thought. Some baths were so vast that they contained libraries and lecture halls, places where philosophers held discussions or poets read their latest verses. The baths were not simply about cleansing the body. They were a stage for the life of the mind, And spirit.evening in the baths had its own rhythm. The light shifted, the marble floors reflecting the fading gold of the day. Steam curled more softly in the dimming air, and voices grew quieter as bathers finished their routines. Outside, the city's bustle resumed, but inside the thermae, there lingered a sense of timelessness, as if the walls themselves had stored the calm of countless evenings, long after the Roman Empire faded. The ruins of these baths remained, emptied pools where water once shimmered, cracked marble floors still bearing the faint polish of countless footsteps, and broken pillars that once framed archways of steam and sun. Even in their silence they seemed to remember the warmth, the voices, and the stillness that once lived within. Mountains, to most ancient civilizations, were boundaries. They were the jagged walls of the world, slow to cross and dangerous to dwell within. But to the Romans who saw the landscape as a challenge, rather than a barrier, mountains became simply another surface to tame. The empire's roads, after all, were not built merely for convenience. They were arteries of power, and an artery cannot be allowed to stop. From the Alps in the north to the rugged hills of Anatolia, Roman engineers faced the problem of altitude. With characteristic patience and ingenuity, where the terrain allowed, they wound their roads in slow, deliberate switchbacks, easing the slope so that carts, animals, and marching soldiers could pass without exhausting themselves in a single, steep climb. Where the cliffs rose too sheer, they cut directly into the rock, shaping the roadbed with chisels and hammers until it clung to the mountainside like a ribbon dot in some cases. The mountains yielded grudgingly, their rock face chipped away over. Weeks and months, leaving sheer walls on one side and dizzying drops on the other. In others, the Romans would drive straight through building tunnels that astonish historians to this day. They began with fire and water, heating the stone until it cracked, then dousing it so fractures widened. Picks, iron chisels, and endless human labor did the rest. Without modern drills, without dynamite, they carved passages where no passage should have been. These routes were more than technical victories, they were lifelines. Through them, Rome could feed its frontier outposts, rush reinforcements to distant provinces, or move goods from inland farms to coastal ports. The Via Claudia. Augusta, for example, threaded its way through the Alps, linking Italy to the provinces of Rhaetia and Noricum. It was not the fastest route in fair weather, but in times of war or famine, it was indispensable. The mountain passes also became places of slow commerce and strange exchange. Imagine the quiet of a high pass at dawn. Thin air, pale light creeping. Over snow-dusted peaks, the muffled crunch of oxen hooves on frozen ground. A line of traders from the south meets a line from the north, olive oil and wine, flowing one way, wool and amber the other. At the roadside, a small stone shrine to a local deity keeps watch, decorated with offerings from travelers seeking safe passage. The Romans, always mindful of endurance, fortified some of these routes. They built stone retaining walls to prevent landslides, carved gutters to channel snowmelt away from the road, and marked dangerous edges with boundary stones. Even high in the mountains, one could find waypoints mansionized where a traveler might rest, eat, and trade news with others on the same path. And then there were the tunnels dark, DAMP, echoing chambers in which torchlight flickered against rock walls. Passing through one, you might hear your own footsteps chasing you from behind, the air cool and smelling faintly of earth and mineral. Some were short cuts under ridges. Others burrowed deep enough to save hours of climbing. To the Romans, these feats were not novelties. They were proof that even the most stubborn obstacle could be persuaded to yield. Today, many of these roads and passes still exist, though softened by centuries of weather and use. Grass grows in cracks between stones, retaining walls have slumped into gentle mounds, and the occasional tunnel mouth gapes in shadow, its purpose long forgotten. But to step onto one of these old paths is to feel the pulse of a people who refused to go around when they could go through. The mountains remain, eternal in their scale, yet they bear the quiet marks of Roman persistence cuttings, walls, tunnels, subtle signatures left in the stone. And in the hush of a high pass, if you listen carefully, you might almost hear the faint clang of iron tools, the voices calling instructions in Latin, and the slow rhythm of an empire moving forward. The Roman market, or forum, was more than a place to purchase goods. It was the living heart of the city, a place where trade, politics, gossip, and daily life flowed together as seamlessly as the stones in its pavements. By day it hummed with the sound of countless footsteps, the calls of vendors, and the chatter of citizens weaving between stalls. By night it grew still, the scent of spices and bread lingering in the cooling air, the empty counters waiting for the next sunrise. Roman arriving at the market would first pass under graceful colonnades. These sheltered walkways framed the bustling central square, their shade offering relief from the midday sun. Along these edges, merchants set up their tables or worked from permanent stone counters, some built into the very architecture of the marketplace. Beneath awnings of canvas or dyed wool, one could find an astonishing variety of wares, gleaming bronze vessels, hand-thrown pottery, jars of olive oil, amphorae of wine, baskets of figs, piles of fresh herbs still smelling of the morning fields. The scents of the forum mingled and shifted with each step. There was the sharp aroma of fish freshly brought from the coast, the sweet perfume of honey cakes, the pungent bite of garlic and onions, the woody fragrance of imported spices, cinnamon, pepper, saffron, stored carefully in small clay jars. Bakers sold loaves still warm from the oven, their crusts crackling under eager fingers. Butchers called out their offerings, displaying cuts of meat on wooden boards, while cheesemakers let passers-by taste wedges of salty PECORINO. Beyond the food stalls, artisans displayed their craft. Jewelers worked at tiny benches, stringing delicate gold chains or setting semi-precious stones into rings. Leather workers sold sandals, belts, and pouches. Linen merchants unfolded bolts of fine fabric, dyed in muted or vivid hues, soft blues, deep reds, golden yellows, while buyers felt the weave between their fingers, bargaining for the best price. The market was also a place of news and politics. Messengers read aloud the latest decrees or announcements, posted on wooden boards or carved into stone tablets. In one corner, a small crowd might gather to hear a traveling storyteller recount tales from far-off provinces. In another, a philosopher. Already could be found delivering a slow, measured argument, drawing nods or protests from listeners. Children darted between the stalls, chasing each other or clutching small treats, while stray dogs lingered hopefully near the fishmongers. The clink of coins was constant, the small bronze and silver pieces passing from hand to hand with practiced speed. Bargaining was expected. A buyer's first offer was met with the vendor's laugh and a higher price, the two meeting somewhere in the middle with a firm handshake or a nod. Even the soundscape of the market was an art. There was the rhythmic slap of dough in the baker's hands, the crackle of roasting meat, the tinkling of a bronze bell, marking the start of the trading day. Somewhere a musician strummed a lute, its soft melody weaving through the calls of sellers and the chatter of the crowd. For the Romans, the market was not only about necessity, but about connection. One could shop quickly if needed, but most lingered, speaking with familiar merchants, exchanging news, enjoying the pleasure of being among others. A trip to the market might end with a stroll through nearby temples or a pause at a fountain to drink cool water before heading home. In the fading light of afternoon, the market began to thin. Merchants packed their goods, folding their awnings and sweeping away the day's debris. The stone floors, worn smooth by centuries of feet, shone faintly in the low sun. The air grew quieter, and soon the marketplace became a wide, calm space once more, ready to fill again with life at dawn. When one imagines the Roman Empire at its height, it is easy to think of the grand cities, the triumphal arches, and the aqueducts that carried water across valleys. Yet perhaps no single achievement shaped the empire's endurance as profoundly as its roads. To the casual eye, they were simply long stretches of stone, stretching straight into the horizon. But for the Romans, these roads were the sinews and arteries of an immense and restless body binding together the farthest reaches of the empire with steady, unbroken lines of travel dot from the chalky hills of Britannia to the sunburned deserts of Syria. Roman roads shared a certain unshakable character. Built with precision and patience, they resisted time, weather, and the endless pounding of cart wheels and marching feet. In their quiet way, they spoke of planning that cared not only for the next decade, but for the centuries. The process of building a road was deliberate. Surveyors first walked the land, sighting along straight lines wherever possible, preferring to cut through obstacles rather than curve around them. This insistence on directness meant that Roman roads often climbed hills without hesitation and descended valleys with careful engineering. Once the route was chosen, the real work began, digging down to create a firm foundation, layering stones and gravel, each fitted with thought. The base might be a deep trench filled with rubble and large stones, above which lay smaller stones for stability, then gravel or sand for leveling. Finally, flat paving stones were set in place, their seams so tightly joined that grass struggled to grow between them. At the road's sides, drainage ditches kept water from loosening the structure. It was not only a feat of engineering, but of foresight. Roads built 2,000 years ago still exist in parts of Europe, their surfaces worn smooth by the passage of countless travelers. To walk one of these roads in the cool of early morning was to feel a connection with all who had traveled before. Soldiers in shining armor, their sandals striking a steady beat. Merchants guiding carts heavy with amphorae of oil or wine. Couriers carrying sealed letters from distant governors. Even the occasional traveler on foot, belongings tied in a cloth bundle, moving slowly from one town to the next. In the heat of midday, the pale stones could almost seem to shimmer, reflecting the sun. The sound of iron-shod hooves striking stone would echo down the line, announcing the approach of a mounted messenger or perhaps a noble family in a carriage. The air might carry scents from far away, a whiff of pine from the hills, or the faint tang of the sea from a coast still day's journey, distant. At intervals, milestones stood beside the road, carved stone markers telling the traveler how far they had come and how far remained to the nearest town. These were not mere decoration. They were part of the Roman sense of order, a quiet assurance that the way ahead was measured and known. Sometimes a traveler might rest at a mansio, a roadside station where fresh horses, food, and shelter could be found. These outposts made it possible to move messages and goods with remarkable speed. Rome's couriers could cover distances that would seem almost unbelievable for the age. Yet beyond the practical, there was something poetic in these roads. They were lines drawn across landscapes that had once been wild and uncertain, a declaration of human intent. And even as empires shifted and borders crumbled, the roads remained. Centuries after the legions had passed, farmers still used them. Shepherds walked their flocks along them, and traders pushed carts filled with goods to markets that had changed names a dozen times. In the evening, as the sun dipped low, the stones took on a softer glow, their edges catching the last gold of daylight. A lone traveler might stop by the roadside, sitting upon a warm stone, and gaze down the road's length, watching as it disappeared into the quiet distance. The straightness seemed to promise something, perhaps not the same empire it once served, but a sense that all roads in their way lead to connection. The heart of the Roman Empire did not beat solely in its forums, palaces, or military camps. It pulsed with life along its coastlines, where harbors drew in the wealth and vitality of far-off lands. Ports were where the empire's hunger for grain, wine, olive oil, marble, spices, and countless other goods was satisfied. They were the thresholds where the Mediterranean Sea ceased to be a barrier and became instead a connective tissue, holding together provinces scattered across continents. In the earliest days of Roman expansion, natural bays and river mouths served as modest docking points. But as the empire's appetite for trade grew, so too did the scale of its maritime infrastructure. Roman engineers transformed unassuming stretches of coast into vast harbors, building breakwaters that reached into the sea like outstretched arms, enclosing calm waters where ships could anchor in safety. The most ambitious among them defied the limitations of stone and timber by inventing a special concrete pozzolanic cement that could harden underwater. With it, they built foundations that have endured the erosion of waves for over 2 millennia. The harbors themselves were more than just open water and piers. They were bustling complexes of warehouses, market stalls, repair yards, customs offices, and watchtowers. Cranes powered by human treadwheels lifted cargo from the holds of merchant ships, while smaller boats ferried goods ashore from larger vessels anchored farther out. In a single morning, a ship might unload amphorae of olive oil from Hispania, bolts of fine linen from Egypt, blocks of marble from Greece, and baskets of dates from North Africa. Ostia, Rome's principal port at the mouth of the Tiber, was a living example of this maritime vigor. Its hexagonal harbor, built under Emperor Trajan, could hold hundreds of ships at once. Imagine approaching it from the deck of a merchant galley, the water inside the breakwaters a deep, welcoming blue, the air thick with the mingled scents of tar, salt, and exotic spices. Dock workers shout in Latin, Greek, and Punic their words, punctuated by the rhythmic creak of ropes and the slap of waves against stone. But Ostia was far from the only jewel of Rome's maritime network. Across the empire, cities such as Carthage, Alexandria, Puteoli, and Caesarea Maritima acted as gateways between land and sea. Some, like Alexandria, were cosmopolitan hubs where scholars, merchants, and sailors shared not just goods but ideas, philosophies, and technologies. Others, like the port of Caesarea, displayed the empire's willingness to wrestle with nature itself, its artificial harbor extending boldly into the open sea, guarded by towering lighthouses and fortified walls. Harbors were also fortresses in their own right. Massive chains could be drawn across narrow entrances to keep out enemy fleets. Watchtowers scanned the horizon for sails, while soldiers stood ready to defend the docks. In times of war, ports became military staging grounds, their piers crowded, with warships' sleek triremes and quinquiremes with banks of oars flashing in the sun. Yet for all their strategic importance, ports were equally places of quiet moments. Picture a fisherman mending his nets in the shade of a warehouse wall, a child watching the sea for the first time, eyes wide as a great grain ship glides in, merchants tallying goods by lamplight, their shadows flickering across stone. Even the vastest harbor could feel intimate when the tide was low, the day hot, and the work slow dot. The Romans understood that an empire without secure harbors was an empire that could starve. The flow of goods was the flow of life itself, grain to feed the capital, timber to build fleets, iron to forge weapons, luxuries to placate the elite. Without their ports, Rome's roads would have led to hunger. not prosperity. Today, some of those harbors lie buried beneath centuries of silt, their outlines traceable only from the air or the sea. Others still function in some form, though modern ships dwarf the old quays. Yet in certain quiet corners where the stone blocks still bear the marks of Roman chisels, you can stand, look out over the water, and imagine the moment a merchant ship appeared on the horizon, its sails catching the wind, bringing the distant edges of the empire just a little closer. The Roman road, for all its efficiency, was only part of the journey. Even the most disciplined legionary or the most determined merchant could not march from dawn to dusk without pause. Along these endless lines of stone, life was punctuated by places where one could rest, eat, and exchange stories, small oases of humanity between stretches of quiet road. The Romans, practical as ever, did not leave such matters to chance. They built an entire system to support travelers, mutations for changing horses, mansionese for lodging, and countless private inns, taverns, and way stations that grew up wherever the flow of traffic promised profit. Every 20 to 30 miles, roughly, the distance a carriage could travel in a day stood a designated stopping place. A mansio was not a place of luxury, but of necessity. Managed by the state for officials, messengers, and soldiers, it was equipped with basic rooms, stables, and supplies. The furnishings were plain wooden benches, straw mattresses, a hearth for warmth, but to a weary traveler they might as well have been gold. At night, the light from the fire would flicker against the walls, casting shadows that made even the most functional architecture feel a little warmer. For common travelers, the options ranged from humble roadside taverns to surprisingly lively inns. The kaupona served food and drink to anyone with coin, often accompanied by the chatter of locals, the clatter of dice, and the occasional brawl. Here the air might smell of stew, wine, and damp cloaks hung near the fire. The innkeeper's voice would carry over the room, calling out for more bread or reminding a guest to settle their tab before leaving. Then there were the stabula, where animals were cared for as carefully as their owners. A merchant might spend the evening rubbing down his mule after a long day, exchanging news with other traders while the animals chewed contentedly on hay. The stables, with their earthy scent and muffled sounds, often felt more alive than the sleeping quarters. Not all roadside stops were for comfort. The mutations, simple horse-changing stations, were vital for the speed of the cursus publicus, Rome's state courier system. Here, a rider could dismount, exchange his tired mount for a fresh one, and be back on the road in minutes. The efficiency was astonishing. Messages could travel from Rome to the far edges of the empire faster than many could imagine, though the couriers themselves might remember little more than the blur of changing landscapes and the smell of dust and sweat. The rhythm of the road was set by these places. A traveler's day began with the first light, a quick meal, and the sound of wheels creaking into motion. The middle hours were for movement passing fields, crossing bridges, watching clouds stretch and change overhead. By late afternoon, thoughts turned to the next inn, to the warmth of a meal, to a chance to rest sore feet and aching backs. And in the evenings, these stops became melting pots. Soldiers bound for distant garrisons might share a bench with merchants returning from the markets of Gaul. Pilgrims on sacred journeys could find themselves seated beside gamblers chasing fortune. All were bound together by the road, each traveling for different reasons, but sharing the same roof for a night. Outside, the road lay in darkness, empty except for the occasional night traveler, a lone figure with a torch, or a cart rolling quietly under the stars. Inside, firelight flickered, voices mingled, and the sounds of life replaced the silence of travel. These places were not grand or famous, but they were the pulse of the Roman road system, beating steadily mile after mile. And perhaps this was the most Roman thing of all, not just to build a way to travel, but to build a way to live along that. Travel a chain of small human spaces stretched across an empire, each one holding the quiet proof that even in an age of conquest and ambition, people still needed a place to rest, to eat, and to simply be. The Roman Empire was, at its core, a network, not merely of cities, provinces, and armies, but of connections, roads that stretched over mountains, cut through forests, and spanned valleys on sturdy bridges. These roads, so straight and deliberate, were the empire's arteries. But even the most disciplined legionary, the most seasoned merchant, or the most tireless courier could not march endlessly without pause. That is where the roadside inns and stations, the mansionese and mutations came into the picture. Every Roman road was punctuated at intervals by these small yet vital havens. To the traveler trudging through dust under a blazing sun, or shivering in a cold drizzle, the sight of one was as welcome as the first star at dusk. The empire's planners knew well that efficient travel depended not only on the durability of the road, but on the comfort of those who used it. Thus, every 20 to 30 miles, one might expect a place to stop, eat, and sleep. The mansio, literally, a stopping place, was more than just a roof and walls. It was an official station, often maintained at the expense of the state, where imperial couriers on the cursus publicus could change horses, rest, and eat. Rooms were simple, furnished with sturdy wooden beds, coarse blankets, and small oil lamps that threw flickering light on plastered walls. The air might smell faintly of smoke from the kitchen hearth, where stews simmered in bronze pots, seasoned with herbs from a nearby garden. For less official travelers, merchants, pilgrims, soldiers on leave, the accommodations varied. Some inns, capone, were honest, offering bread, cheese, olives, and a jug of watered wine at fair prices. Others had reputations for overcharging and underfeeding, their innkeepers as quick with a smile as they were with an inflated bill. In more rural stretches, a taberna might serve both as a bar and a makeshift hostel, the common room loud with conversation and a dozen accents. The mutations, by contrast, were smaller posts intended for changing horses and little else. Here, travelers could rest briefly while fresh animals were brought out, the stable boys working quickly to harness them. The soundscape of such places was a mixture of stamping hooves, clinking harness buckles, and the murmur of conversation as riders stretched their legs before resuming their journey. Life around these roadside stops was a constant ebb and flow. At dawn, a few travelers might set out together, bound for the same destination, the mist still clinging to the fields. By midday, dusty caravans would arrive, their drivers leading mules laden with goods. In the evening, tired footsteps would echo through the courtyard, and the inn's hearth would glow with the promise of warmth and food. They were also centers of information. A traveler could learn the latest news of an emperor's decree, a recent battle, a flood in a far-off province, while breaking bread with strangers. A single night in a bustling inn could leave one richer in both knowledge and acquaintances, though perhaps lighter in coin. Yet there was a softer, more intimate side to these places as well. Imagine an inn on a winter night, snow falling silently. Outside, inside, a fire crackles. A soldier, his armor stacked neatly in a corner, cradles a cup of wine. A merchant counts coins under the low light, while a weary family settles into a corner with a basket of bread and dates. The walls keep. Out the wind, the food chases away the chill, and the road seems for a time very far away. Today, few of these stations remain intact. Some are little more than scattered stones by the roadside, their outlines barely visible beneath grass and soil. Yet their legacy persists in the way we travel. The rest stops. Motels and cafes along our highways are the descendants of those Roman mansionees. The empire understood a truth as old as travel itself, that the journey is made easier and more human by places to pause, to rest, and to share the company of others. Rivers were both friend and obstacle to the Romans. They offered water, fertile land, and routes for trade, yet they also stood in the way of the empire's roads and armies. To command a river was to command the land around it, and so the Romans became masters at spanning waterways with structures as enduring as their ambition. The art of building bridges was one of Rome's most celebrated engineering achievements. These were not temporary solutions of wood and rope, nor crude fords that could be washed away in a flood. Roman bridges were built to last centuries, some surviving even to this day, standing solid in the currents, their arches casting steady reflections across the water's surface. The key to their success lay in two elements, the arch and the materials. The Roman arch, perfected over generations, distributed weight evenly, allowing for bridges that could carry enormous loads without collapsing. Instead of bearing the full weight directly downward like a flat beam, the arch transferred stress into its supports, the piers which rose from the riverbed. For materials, the Romans used stone and concrete. Stone gave beauty and weight, but concrete gave flexibility and speed. Their concrete, a mixture of lime, volcanic ash, and rubble, could even set under water, a marvel known as pozzolana. This allowed the Romans to sink wooden cofferdams into the river pump out the water, and build solid piers right in the current. Once the piers were in place, stone arches could rise above them. Each wedge-shaped block, voussoir, fitted so precisely that the structure needed no mortar. The keystone at the center locked everything into place. Bridges were more than engineering feats. They were strategic tools. Military roads depended on them, enabling legions to cross swiftly into enemy territory or rush back to defend a province. A well-built bridge could secure a conquest just as surely as a fortress. Julius Caesar himself understood this, famously, building a wooden bridge across the Rhine in just 10 days to demonstrate Rome's reach and resolve. Culturally, bridges also became symbols. In Rome itself, the Pons Aemilius, known today as the Broken Bridge, was one of the first stone bridges across the Tiber, a proud statement that this city could tame even its own river. Many bridges were adorned with statues, carvings, and inscriptions, turning functional crossings into civic monuments. Yet the Romans were also pragmatic. Not every crossing demanded a monumental bridge. In lesser-traveled areas, they built simpler timber structures or stone causeways across shallow waters. In mountainous regions where rivers ran narrow and fierce, they might string wooden beams between rocky outcrops, using local materials and labor. Even so, whether humble or grand, each Roman bridge was part of a greater network. They allowed goods to move, messages to travel, and soldiers to march without pause. In an empire where time was often the difference between victory and loss, bridges were not luxuries. They were necessities. Imagine a quiet evening in the ancient world, the sun dipping low, turning the river's surface to molten gold. A merchant's cart rumbling softly over stone, the gentle echo of footsteps on the arch. Down below, the current flows steady and eternal, wrapping around the piers like a ribbon. Above, life moves forward, carried safely by the strength of Roman hands. Even now, centuries later, some of these bridges remain. Moss grows between the stones, the edges softened by time, but the arches still hold firm, as if guarding the memory of the empire that built them. They are reminders that the Romans did not merely cross rivers, they claimed them, binding them into the body of their world. The Roman road was more than a ribbon of stone linking distant cities. It was a living corridor of human activity, dotted with small havens where weary travelers could rest, eat, and gather strength for the miles ahead. These stopping points, whether humble roadside taverns or the more official mansionese, were as essential to Rome's infrastructure as the roads themselves. Without them, the network would have been an endurance trial. With them, it became a rhythm of travel, a sequence of exertion and repose. The humblest of these shelters were the copone, the inns that sprang up to serve merchants, farmers bringing goods to market, and common travelers without the privilege of official status. They were often noisy, smoky, and filled with the scent of roasting meat mingled with the sharper tang of wine. Their walls might be rough stone or mud brick, their floors a mix of packed earth and worn tile. But to a weary pedestrian, a capona's open doorway promised relief from dust and sun. Here one could find bread still warm from the oven, stew bubbling in a clay pot, and a pitcher of wine to ease the aches of the road. These places were not always reputable. Satirists of the time painted them as dens of petty theft, gossip, and watered wine. But for the everyday traveler, they were lifelines offering a bed, however hard, and a bowl of food, however simple. Far grander were the mansionets, the official, state-run lodgings that served imperial couriers, military officers, and government officials. Strategically placed a day's journey apart, each mansio was a fortress of rest. High walls enclosed a courtyard, stables, and storerooms. Spacious, rooms offered better bedding than the average home. Kitchens prepared food for men and animals alike. Here, a traveler with the right credentials could sleep in relative comfort, knowing that the next day's ride or march would begin with a full stomach and rested limbs. Alongside the mansionese were the mutations. Relay stations were fresh. Horses awaited messengers and military riders. These were the heartbeat of Rome's communication network. Messages from distant provinces could be carried to the capital in astonishing speed sometimes, covering over 100 miles a day, because horses and riders were exchanged at each mutatio, ensuring neither grew too fatigued to continue. Placement of these facilities reflected careful planning. Distances between stations considered the terrain, the climate, and the average speed of travel. In the flat countryside, they might be spaced farther apart. In mountainous regions where progress slowed, the gaps would shrink. The network functioned like a living organism, each part working in harmony to keep the empire's vast body connected dot to the modern eye. There's something almost poetic in imagining this system. A soldier arriving at a mansio at dusk, his boots powdered with dust, the scent of cooking drifting across the courtyard. A merchant haggling with an innkeeper over the price of a bed. A courier galloping into a mutatio at full speed, leaping from his saddle before the next rider takes the message and vanishes down the road. Even the most modest roadside inn played its part in the empire's lifeblood. Travelers shared stories here of politics in Rome, of strange goods from the East, of distant battles and unexpected victories. The road was a thread that wove these tales together, and the ends were its knots, holding the fabric of the empire firm. Today, the stone foundations of some mansionese still lie along forgotten stretches of Roman road, their walls long gone, but their placement unmistakable. Stand in one, and you can almost hear the echo of horses' hooves, the murmur of conversation over a shared meal, the clatter of a wine jug set down on a wooden table dot in the end. Rome's roads did not just carry armies and merchants. They carried people, and those people needed places to rest. Without the corpone, mansionese, and mutations, the roads would have been empty, their promise of connection left unfulfilled. Before the first stone was laid, before the first shovel bit into the earth, the Romans began every great road with something both invisible and essential: measurement. The art of surveying was the quiet magic that transformed vast, untamed landscapes into straight, enduring highways. It was not a matter of guesswork or wandering instinct. It was a discipline of mathematics, geometry, and relentless precision. The surveyors, known as agrimensors or grommetici, were the unseen architects of Rome's empire. They traveled ahead of the builders, marking the path that would carry soldiers, merchants, and messengers for centuries to come. These men carried with them not the tools of a laborer, but the instruments of an exacting craft, the groma for, aligning straight lines, the corybates for leveling surfaces, the measuring rods for recording distances. Each device, simple in design yet brilliant in application, ensured that the road ahead would be as direct and enduring as Roman ambition itself. The groma, perhaps the most iconic of these tools, was nothing more than a vertical staff with cross arms and hanging plumb lines. Yet in skilled hands it became the means by which the earth itself could be inscribed with straightness. A grammaticus would plant the groma firmly in the ground, align its arms with distant markers, and set out guide, stakes to show the path. Over hills, through valleys, even across uneven rock. This process ensured that the road would not wander or meander, but slice through the landscape with purpose. For leveling, especially when building aqueducts or stretches of road where even the slightest slope could mean disaster, the Romans used the corybates. This long, beam-like instrument, often fitted with water channels or plumb lines, could measure inclines with astonishing accuracy. With it, the surveyors could ensure that a road drained properly, neither pooling water in the rain nor eroding away in the wet seasons. Measuring distances was equally important. Standard units like the passus, a double step, about 1.48 meters, and the milpasum, 1,000 paces. The origin of the mile allowed them to plot and record each segment of road with precision. Milestone stone markers engraved with the distance from Rome or another key city were placed at regular intervals. These markers were not merely practical. They were declarations of Rome's reach, carved into stone for all to see. Surveying also had a political dimension. Choosing. The course of a road was not always about the shortest route. It was about visibility, accessibility, and control. A road that crested a hill might cost more to build, but could serve as a constant reminder of Roman presence to the surrounding countryside. In other cases, roads bypassed dangerous marshes or hostile territories, not for efficiency's sake, but for safety. The skill of the agrimensors was so respected that they were often called upon to resolve disputes over land boundaries. Their measurements carried legal authority, their word backed by both technical expertise and imperial power. Inscriptions from their work survive in stone, showing careful diagrams and coordinates, proof that Roman surveying was not guesswork. But science to modern eyes, the results are still astonishing. Satellite images reveal Roman roads cutting across Europe and the Mediterranean with an almost uncanny straightness, surviving centuries of erosion, war, and neglect. That such accuracy was achieved without modern instruments is a testament to the discipline and training of the Grum at ICI. It is worth imagining the beginning of a road-building season. The surveyors rising at dawn, their shadows stretching long over fields. The clink of metal tools as they set their groma upright. The murmur of calculation as they decide how to cut through a ridge or skirt a stream. In that quiet moment before the roar of construction began, the entire destiny of the road was decided. Every traveler who ever set foot on a Roman road from the emperor's courier to the wandering trader walked upon the vision first drawn by these men. The road's strength lay not just in its stones, but in the invisible lines plotted with care, and intellect stretching from one horizon to the next. In the vast network of Roman roads, where one path could stretch for hundreds of miles and another branch off toward distant, unfamiliar lands, there was comfort in knowing exactly where you stood. The Romans understood that roads alone were not enough. Travelers needed orientation, reassurance, and a sense of progress. And so, along the edges of their stone-paved highways, they placed markers, silent guides that spoke without voice. These were the milestones, solid columns of stone, usually cylindrical, sometimes square, rising waist-high or taller from the earth. Each one bore inscriptions carved into its surface, their letters deep enough to last for centuries. The text often named the reigning emperor, a reminder of whose authority made the road possible, and then told the distance to the nearest city, or the capital itself. For the average traveler, whether a merchant with a cart full of olive oil, a soldier marching with his cohort, or a messenger carrying a sealed scroll, these milestones were a quiet comfort. In a time before maps could be tucked into a pocket, each stone was both a signpost and a promise. You are on the right road, and Rome has not forgotten where you are. The origins of the Roman milestone system trace back to the Milurium Aureum, the golden milestone, set up by Emperor Augustus in the Forum of Rome. This central marker was considered the symbolic starting point for all roads in the empire. The distances on countless milestones far from the capital were measured from this spot, as if invisible threads connected every corner of the empire back to the heart of the city. The milestones themselves were works of subtle craftsmanship, carved from durable stone like marble, granite, or local limestone. They were carefully shaped and set into the ground so they could withstand centuries of weather. The inscriptions were painted in bright red or black pigment to make them easier to read. Though the colors have long since faded, spacing was precise. One milestone every Roman mile roughly, 1,480 meters, regardless of terrain, uphill, downhill. Through forest or open plains, the rhythm of the markers stayed steady. A traveler could use them to measure time as well as distance, estimating how many hours or days the journey ahead might take. There were also smaller boundary markers, less grand but no less important, that showed the limits of a town's territory or the reach of a toll station. These kept disputes over land and road maintenance to a minimum. In some places, milestones carried more than practical information. They could commemorate repairs to the road, ordered by a governor or financed by a wealthy citizen. They could Record the year the road was completed, the names of those who built it, and even warnings to respect imperial property. In their quiet way, they were pieces of propaganda reminders that the emperor's reach extended into every mile of stone. Beneath a traveler's feet, imagine the experience of walking along the Via Appia, the queen of roads. The sun beats down, the scent of dust and distant olive groves fills the air, and every mile or so you pass one of these stone sentinels. The letters may be weathered, but their meaning is clear. The road is cared for, measured, and known. Even in the most remote countryside, you're still under Rome's gaze. Over centuries, many milestones fell or were repurposed into building material, but some still stand where Roman engineers placed them. Touching their surface today is like shaking hands across 2,000 years with the road builders and travelers who once relied on them. To the Romans, roads were the empire's arteries, but milestones were its heartbeat, steady and regular, reminding all who traveled that the empire was vast, but it was also connected. To travel across the Roman Empire was to move through a geography of shifting challenges, rolling plains, dense forests, wetlands, and most imposing of all, mountains. The rivers could be bridged, the forests could be cleared, but mountains, those bows. Immense, unyielding walls required an entirely different kind of persistence. The Romans did not always go around them. Sometimes the quickest path forward was not over, but through, and so they learned to carve the earth itself. A Roman tunnel did not begin with brute force. It began with careful thought. Surveyors armed with measuring rods, Groma crosshairs, and a profound patience would chart the straightest line possible from one side of the obstacle to the other. They studied the slope, the rock type, and the best access points, knowing that once the digging began, there would be little room for correction. Workers would then begin from both ends at once, and sometimes from vertical shafts sunk along the line so that teams could work in multiple places simultaneously. They used picks, chisels, and hammers, chipping away at the stubborn stone. The work was slow, the air often thick with dust, the light faint from flickering oil lamps. Every blow of iron on rock echoed in the confined space, a dull rhythm that might carry for hours, even days, before a change in pitch signaled that the rock face was thinning. When the two ends finally met, it was a moment of quiet triumph. The alignment, if perfect, was a testament to the surveyor's skill. If imperfect, it was corrected with care until a clear path was formed. These tunnels had many purposes. Some were part of aqueduct systems like the long underground sections of the Aqua Claudia, carrying water through hills without a break in gradient. Others were purely for roads, allowing carts, animals, and travelers to pass through where mountain ridges might otherwise slow or halt them. A few were drainage tunnels, cutting through ridges to let floodwaters escape from valleys. The Grotta di Coccio in Italy, built in the 1st century BCE, ran more than a kilometer through solid rock, connecting the town of Cumae to Lake Avernus. Imagine walking that length in the dim light, your footsteps echoing off the walls, the coolness of the air, a stark contrast to the heat outside. Mountain passes, where tunneling wasn't necessary, were shaped and smoothed into steady gradients. Loose rocks were cleared, retaining walls built, and drainage ditches dug to keep rain from eroding the path. These passes often became more than just roads, they were stages for breathtaking views. Travelers could stand at the crest and look down over valleys dotted with farms, winding rivers, and, in the distance, the silver line of the sea. Yet the beauty of these routes did not disguise their difficulty. Snow could pile high in winter. Winds could whip through the gaps. Animals carrying loads would need steady guiding hands to keep them from slipping. Still, the Romans maintained these paths because they understood that in the empire's great web of roads, no link could be left incomplete. Walking through a Roman tunnel, even today, you can feel a strange stillness. The walls bear the marks of chisels from 2 millennia ago. The air is cooler, quieter, and the outside world feels far away. Then, as you emerge into daylight, the road continues without pause, as if the mountain had never been there at all. For the Romans, these cuts through stone were not simply about speed, they were about continuity. No break in the road meant no break in connection. It was the same principle that guided their bridges, their causeways, and their roads across every landscape. The journey must flow, unbroken, until its end. If the Roman road was the empire's unbroken thread, then its bridges were the delicate stitches that held that thread across the gaps. Without them, rivers would have been barriers, journeys interrupted by ferries or long detours. With them, the road became seamless, moving over water as easily as it passed through fields and hills. The Romans were not the first to build bridges, but they were the first to make them endure in such great numbers. Their approach was simple in principle and masterful in execution. Find the narrowest crossing where the river runs most steadily. Lay solid foundations and then build not just for today's traveler, but for those centuries yet to come. Key was in the piers, those sturdy legs set deep into the riverbed. Workers would drive wooden piles into the earth, then enclose the space in a watertight barrier called a cofferdam, pumping or bailing out water so that stonemasons could work in the dry. Into this space they laid heavy blocks of stone, often bound with iron clamps and sealed with pozzolanic concrete, a mixture that could even set under water. Once the piers were in place, the rest of the bridge could rise like a calm arch above the restless current. Arches were the Romans' favorite tool here. The curved design distributed weight evenly and allowed water to flow freely beneath, reducing the strain on the structure. Walk across such a bridge, and you might not think about the forces at work beneath your feet, but the Romans always had. Some bridges were strictly utilitarian, like the simple stone spans along lesser roads. Others were grand statements, combining utility with a sense of permanence and pride. In cities, they became almost ceremonial gateways, places where processions could pass, where merchants could linger to watch the water, and where travelers might stop to take in the view. The Pons Fabricius in Rome still stands after more than 2,000 years, connecting the city to Tiber Island. Its surface is worn smooth by countless footsteps, its stones weathered but unbroken. The Alcantara Bridge in Spain, stretching across the Tagus River, still bears an inscription dedicating it to the emperors and to eternity. Such inscriptions were not idle boasts, they were promises, and the Romans kept them. Crossing a Roman bridge was not only a practical matter, it was a quiet shift in experience. The sound of boots or cart wheels on stone took on a different rhythm. The smell of water rose from below. The cool air off the river brushed against travelers' faces. They might glance over the side and see their reflections broken by ripples, or watch fish dart between shadows dot in winter. The water would move sluggishly under thin ice near the banks. In spring, floods could roar beneath, their force resisted by the angled cutwaters of the piers. In summer, the water might shrink and slow, revealing stones and reeds at the edges. But the bridge endured through all seasons solid, unmoving, quietly patient. For those who traveled often, certain bridges became landmarks, even friends. A soldier returning from years of service might step onto a familiar span and feel that he was finally nearly home. A merchant might mark his progress by the rivers he had crossed, each bridge a small victory on the way to his destination at night. Torches lit the way across, their flames reflected in the black water below. Sounds of the river and the echo of footsteps would fill the air, blending into something both soothing and steady. Bridges were more than stone. They were the steady assurance that the road would carry you forward. No matter the obstacle dot in the Roman mind, a bridge was a promise made solid, that the empire's reach could span water as easily as it spanned land. And centuries later, when many of their roads have faded into dust, these arches of stone still carry travelers, quietly keeping their promise. The early stone paths of scattered settlements were the humble ancestors of something far greater. When Rome began to rise not as a single city, but as the heart of a growing network of towns, provinces, and outposts, it inherited the simple idea of a durable path and transformed it into a vast, calculated system. The Romans did not merely lay down roads where people already traveled. They measured, surveyed, and cut their way through hills, across valleys, and sometimes directly through rock to create the most direct routes possible. Where earlier roads followed the lay of the land, Roman roads bent the land itself to their design to stand at the edge of a newly built. Roman road in its prime was to see something almost unnatural in its precision. It stretched before you a long, unbroken line disappearing into the horizon like a deliberate stroke of ink. The edges were crisp, the surface firm, the width consistent, built not for one cart, but for two to pass comfortably. The genius of Roman road construction lay in its layered structure. First came a deep trench, dug until it reached solid ground. At the bottom, large stones or rubble formed the foundation. This was the stadamen, the unshakable base. Above it came the rudis, a middle layer of smaller stones mixed with lime. pressed down into a hard, supportive bed. On top of that, a finer layer called the nucleus, often made of gravel and sand, created a smooth bedding for the final surface. The summum dorsum, flat paving stones carefully fitted together. Each road was slightly convex, its center higher than its edges, allowing rainwater to drain into ditches on either side. This kept the surface dry and reduced wear, which is why, even after 2,000 years, many Roman roads still exist. But Roman roads were more than engineering marvels. They were instruments of control and communication. Legions could march. With speed and discipline, supplies could be moved in any season, and messages could cross the empire faster than ever before. A Roman courier on horseback could cover distances in a matter of days that would have taken weeks on older, uneven paths. The roads were also studded with milestones, stone markers that gave distances to the nearest city, often inscribed with the name of the emperor under whose reign the road had been built or repaired. In a way, these were not just measurements of space, but subtle reminders of Rome's presence and authority. For the common traveler, the roads were a blessing and a burden. They made movement easier, yes, but they also made it harder to remain. Untouched by Rome, soldiers could arrive in days, tax collectors in hours. News from the capital in the time it once took a rumor to cross a valley. The road was a thread, binding even the most remote villages into the empire's web. In the warm Mediterranean air, these roads would shimmer at midday. In cooler provinces, they would crunch under frost in the early morning, the sound of iron, shoes on stone echoing through the stillness. Merchants, pilgrims, and wanderers all walked these same surfaces, leaving no marks that would last, yet all carried forward by the same silent stone beneath them. Over centuries, the Roman road system would grow to span over 250,000 miles, with more than 50,000 miles paved. Many would outlive the empire itself, used by medieval traders, by armies of entirely different nations, and even by the modern traveler who may not know they are following the line of a road designed when Latin was still the language of power. And so the Roman road was not just a path, it was an idea, stretched taut across continents, that with enough will and skill, you could make the world itself a little smoother beneath your feet. Before the paved road, travel was an uneven thing. Paths were no more than the flattened memory of many footsteps, pressed into grass or dirt over seasons and years. In dry weather, these tracks were dusty ribbons, their edges fraying into wild growth. In rain, they became troughs of mud, pulling at cartwheels and soaking the hems of travelers' garments. Journeys were measured not only by distance, but by how long the earth would allow one to pass. Yet as settlements grew and the exchange of goods began to stretch beyond the limits of a day's walk, there arose anew need roads that could endure. Not just for the local farmer bringing grain to market, but for traders carrying salt, metal, pottery, and wool across the spaces between towns. The answer, slowly, was to build the road itself rather than let it happen by chance. The first paved roads were humble experiments. In some regions, flat stones were laid side by side across wet or boggy ground, creating a firm crossing where feet would no longer sink. Elsewhere, gravel or broken rock was spread across the path, packed down with repeated use until it became something solid and smooth. These were the beginning's practical solutions without ornament, but they changed the rhythm of movement. A paved road was not only a surface, it was a promise. It said, "This way will hold even after the rains." A cart could roll without its wheels sinking into the muck. A traveler could walk without watching each step for puddles and soft earth. The road made distances feel smaller, as if the world itself was leaning forward to meet you. Imagine one of these early stone-laid paths. The rocks are not cut into perfect shapes, just chosen for their flattest faces, their most willing edges. They sit together like mismatched puzzle pieces, gaps filled with smaller stones or pressed earth. Here and there, grass grows between them, thin and stubborn. The sound of feet on such a path is different, a soft, irregular clack, a rhythm that carries far in the still air dot in the beginning. Only the busiest routes were worth paving. To prepare them, workers would dig a shallow trench, removing the loose topsoil. Larger stones formed the foundation, smaller stones or gravel were laid above, and finally a smoother surface of flat rocks completed the work. It was laborious, but the result could last years, even decades, without repair. Some ancient builders discovered that slightly raising the center of the road allowed rainwater to run off into shallow ditches at the sides. This simple insight kept the surface drier, reducing damage from erosion. Over time, this design became more deliberate, turning the road into a shaped structure, not just a spread of stone. A paved road could change a community. Farmers might find new markets for their goods. Craftsmen could bring their wares to distant buyers. News, whether joyous or grim, could travel faster than before. And while these first paved roads were modest compared to the grand causeways and engineered highways yet to come, they were the beginning of a different relationship with the land. The road was no longer simply through nature. It was over it, a thin, deliberate layer of human intention laid across the earth. And while the earliest builders could not have known it, these paths were the seeds of networks that would one day stretch across continents. If you stood beside one of these first paved roads in the quiet of morning, you might see a lone traveler in the distance walking steadily toward the horizon. The sound of their footsteps would reach you long before their face was clear, and when they passed, you might notice that the dust of the unpaved world clung less stubbornly to their feet. They would move on, and the road would remain patient, enduring, waiting for the next to come. Before stone bridges arched across valleys, before cobblestones formed the long, twisting veins of ancient cities, there were rivers, broad, winding, and patient. To those who lived beside them, rivers were not simply bodies of water. They were pathways, slow-moving and silent, that could take you from one world into another without ever stepping onto the open sea. Imagine a time before maps, before the land was measured and divided. If you stood on the bank of a great river in the early morning, the mist curling above its surface, you would not see a road in the way we think of one today, yet every fisherman, every hunter, every trader would have understood it as such. It was a road without ruts, a road that changed with the rains and the seasons. But it carried travelers just the same. The first canoes carved from hollow logs were not built for the sea's unpredictable swells. They were made for these gentler waters. A single paddle stroke could push a vessel forward, the current itself lending a steady hand. Downstream, the journey was almost effortless. The river carried you, asking only that you steer gently between its bends. Upstream was another matter, but even that was easier than dragging a load across dense forest or uneven hills. Poles could be pushed into the riverbed, ropes pulled from the shore, or the boat itself walked along the shallows. Rivers connected places that seemed otherwise impossible to reach. One could begin in a village tucked deep in the interior, follow the river through miles of woodland, and find oneself eventually at the edge of the sea, where ships with strange shapes and unfamiliar sails would arrive from beyond the horizon. To follow the river was to follow a thread that stitched together distant lands, and so early settlements clustered along riverbanks. The water was a source of food, of course, fish darting beneath the surface, reeds for weaving, clay from the muddy edges for making pots. But more importantly, it was a way to remain part of a wider network. News traveled along the river as surely as goods did. A carved wooden idol from an inland tribe might find its way to the coast. A string of bright shells from the shore might be worn in a village hundreds of miles upstream. The banks themselves became places of pause, much like the early harbors. A flat stretch of shore might become a landing place where boats could be pulled up and repaired. Over time, these spots took on names, became known to travelers, and perhaps saw the first exchange of coin or barter. In certain bends where the water ran deep and slow, larger gatherings might form, seasonal markets, meeting points for marriages between distant communities, or simply places to tell stories around the fire while the river whispered in the darkness. There was a rhythm to life along a river, dictated not by the turning of the sun alone, but by the rise and fall of the water. In the rainy season, the river swelled, sometimes claiming farmland, sometimes creating new fertile banks. In the dry months, its course might shrink, revealing hidden sandbars or stones worn smooth by centuries of current. Those who lived here learned to read the signs, the subtle change in the color of the water that meant floods might come. The clusters of waterfowl that signaled fish were plentiful dot in many early cultures. Rivers were more than tools for travel. They were living beings. They had names, personalities, tempers. They could be generous, offering safe passage and abundant catch, or wrathful, flooding without warning. They were often seen as the boundary between worlds, the land of the living and the land of the dead, the familiar and the unknown. To set out upon the river was not only a physical journey, but a symbolic one. a step into another realm where the path was unseen beneath the water's surface. Over time, as tools and knowledge advanced, rivers were tamed, or so people thought. Simple. Rafts became sturdy boats. Boats became barges, capable of carrying timber, grain, or stone for the building of great cities. The river's role as a road only grew more important. Entire economies floated upon its surface. Empires depended on these watery highways to move their armies as much as their merchants. Yet no matter how much they were used, rivers remained unpredictable. A sudden change in course could strand a settlement. A drought could choke off an entire trade route. Even to today, in the quiet early hours, you can stand on the edge of a great river and hear the same song that people heard thousands of years ago, the murmur of water against the shore, the splash of a fish breaking the surface, the groan of wood as a boat drifts by, its oars dipping in unhurried rhythm. These sounds have carried goods, people, and stories for longer than written history remembers. And if you follow the river far enough, whether upstream to its narrow beginnings or downstream to where it surrenders to the sea, you are walking in the footsteps of countless others who saw not just water, but the most ancient kind of road. Before there were walls of stone, before towers rose against the horizon, before a city's name could be written down, there were harbors, or at least the first quiet shapes of them. These were not yet the organized, bustling ports that later fed entire empires, but simple resting places shaped by the hands of wind, tide, and time. A bend in the coastline, a gentle curve of sand between two protective headlands, a mouth of a river spilling into the sea with just enough shelter from the pounding waves. Imagine the people who first found them. Perhaps they had been fishing along a wild, rocky shore, their small vessel battered by sudden squalls. Perhaps they had been following the coastline for days, sleeping in their boat, surviving on the catch they pulled from the water. Then, one evening, the horizon broke to reveal a stretch of still water, shimmering faintly in the fading light. Framed by land on three sides, the wind softened. The water smoothed. The oars dipped easily, and the shore called to them with a promise of rest. At first, these early harbors were nothing more than places of pause. A man might drag his canoe from the tide and leave it resting on the wet sand. A family might spread their nets on the rocks to dry in the sun. Fires were lit, both for warmth and for cooking, and the smoke curled gently into the sky, not only a signal to those returning from the sea, but a sign to others that here, on this stretch of shore, people were welcome. There was no thought yet of trade in the modern sense, no bustling market stalls or warehouses. But there was always exchange, even in the earliest days. A fish shared in return for a clay jar of clean water, a bundle of dried seaweed given, and thanks for a borrowed spear. These harbors, however humble, became places where knowledge flowed, as freely as the tide. A visitor might speak of a distant shore, of the kinds of fish found in deeper waters, of storms seen gathering far away. In this way, harbors were always more than just shelter. They were windows to the wider world. Over time, people began to recognize the value of these safe anchorages. They returned to them again and again, season after season. Some stayed longer than they had planned, patching their boats, repairing their gear, exploring the land nearby. And slowly the landscape changed. Stones were piled along the water's edge to hold back the waves. Thick wooden posts were driven into the sand, their tops smoothed by rope and salt. Paths began to form between the shoreline and the inland. Trails. The harbor was no longer just a place to stop. It was becoming a place to stay docked. With staying came building. A simple hut to store fishing tools, another to shelter travelers. Eventually, a small cluster of shelters might rise, each one a sign that people believed this place was worth returning to. And with permanence came greater encounters. One day a sail might appear on the horizon, a vessel not from the nearest village, but from a place further along the coast, or even across the sea. Strangers would step ashore, their clothing woven differently, their language carrying unfamiliar sounds. And yet, here in the calm of the harbor, they would find welcome. This is perhaps the most enduring truth of harbors. They are places of meeting. They are the thresholds between home and the unknown. In them, a fisherman might meet a trader, a traveler might meet a local elder, and both might share stories neither had heard before. Goods would change hands, dried fish for polished stones, woven mats for strange shells, and so would ideas. Some harbors stayed small forever, known only to a few, their quiet broken only by the occasional creak of a boat's hull against the shore. Others grew. Year after year, more people came, drawn by the safety, the resources, and the connections a harbor offered. A larger breakwater might be built. The muddy shoreline might be reinforced with timber. And as the harbor became more dependable, so did its role in human life. Villages grew along its edges. Markets formed. Rituals emerged, blessings for the boats before they went out to sea, ceremonies to welcome them home. In the ancient world, the great cities of maritime trade almost always began this way, with a small, calm stretch of water where people could rest and where the sea could be held briefly at bay. Even today, under the layers of concrete piers and towering cranes, the soul of a harbor remains the same. It is the meeting place of journeys, the point where the vastness of the sea yields to the stability of land. When the tide is low and the modern port is quiet, you might still see the curve of the old shoreline beneath the docks. You might imagine, if you close your eyes, the sound of woven nets being shaken out to dry, the gentle murmur of strangers trading words in halting voices, the smell of wood smoke drifting over calm water. The first harbors are still with us, if we know how to look for them. If we could peel back the waters of today's oceans, draining them away for just a moment, we would see a very different earth beneath. Great swaths of land would appear, drowned plains, ancient valleys, and winding riverbeds, all hidden, now beneath the blue. These were once coastlines walked upon by people, animals, and winds that no longer touch the surface. They are gone from sight, but not from history. During the last ice age, So much water was locked in glaciers and polar ice caps that the sea level was far lower than it is now. The outlines of continents stretched further outward, giving the world vast, exposed shelves that today are hidden under shallow seas. In places like Southeast Asia, what we know as islands were once connected by dry land. In the North Sea, between Britain and mainland Europe, there was a wide, fertile plain, a place we now call Doggerland, home to rivers, lakes, forests, and people. These vanished shores were not barren wastelands. They were alive with life. Herds of deer and wild cattle grazed there. Rivers carried salmon and trout down to the coast. Small human communities thrived on the resources, fishing in the streams, gathering shellfish, hunting game, and perhaps building early boats to venture onto the open sea. The air would have been different there, carrying a mix of forest scent and salt spray, the cry of seabirds mingling with the rustle of wind and grass. The end of these lands came slowly at first, then suddenly, as the great ice sheets began to melt. The seas crept inland, year by year. What might have been a small change in a single lifetime, perhaps the loss of a favorite fishing cove, or the slow swallowing of a meadow, was part of a much larger transformation. Over generations, the people of these lands would have seen the world they knew shrink. Villages were abandoned, hunting grounds drowned, paths leading to nowhere but water. Sometimes the end came violently. A massive flood, driven by storms, or the sudden release of glacial meltwater could sweep away whole settlements in a single day. Legends from different parts of the world speak of great floods, not as a single global event, but as many local cataclysms, each one searing itself into the memory of those who survived. Beneath the waves, these vanished shores are still there. Divers exploring certain shallow seas sometimes find tree stumps, still rooted in place, or the remains of hearths, stone tools, and even human bones. The sea covers them now in silence, but in their time they would have been places of warmth, noise, and life. The seabed remembers in its layers pollen from vanished meadows, shells from estuaries long gone, the bones of creatures that no longer walk the earth. Perhaps this is why humans are so often drawn to the shore, even in our age. Somewhere deep in memory, we have walked out further than the beaches we know. We have lived in places now claimed by the sea. The wave's edge might feel like a limit today, but in truth it is just another shifting border, as temporary as those first coastlines long ago. It is a strange thing to imagine, but there was once a time when the shorelines of our world were not the ones we know today. The map of the earth has never been fixed. It is a living thing, breathing slowly in geological time. Coasts advance and retreat, not in years or even centuries, but over thousands upon thousands of seasons. The places we now call ancient were themselves once young, raw and unshaped in the deep past. The coastlines were not neat boundaries between land and sea. They were sprawling zones of marsh, lagoon, tidal plain, and sandbar. These were shifting places where the tide could creep miles inland during one part of the year, only to withdraw again in another. Such environments bred life and abundance, reeds that swayed with the water's edge, schools of silver fish flashing in the shallows, great flocks of seabirds nesting in the grasses. For early humans, these coasts were both generous and unpredictable. Archaeologists have found evidence that some of humanity's earliest settlements were not inland villages or highland shelters, but rather seasonal camps along the shore. These were not towns in the way we think of them, with walls and streets, but temporary arrangements of shelters made from driftwood, woven reeds, and hides. People came to the shore, not just for food, though the shore gave much, but for connection. The ocean connected them to distant lands, even if they did not yet know those lands existed. Shells from hundreds of miles away have been found in early coastal sites, traded hand to hand, coast to coast, long before any written record existed. These early coastlines held a delicate balance between stability and change. Storms could erase a whole camp in a single night, dragging huts into the water and scattering possessions across the sand. A new sandbar might appear after a storm, altering the way fish moved or the way boats could land. And yet, people returned to the same places year after year, generation after generation, because they understood the rhythms of these edges. They knew where to dig for shellfish, when to gather seaweed, when the fish would run in glittering shoals close to shore. What makes the first coastlines so fascinating is how deeply they shaped the human sense of time. The tides offered one cycle twice daily. The water rose and fell, marking the hours in a way no sun shadow could match. The moon offered another, with its pull creating spring tides and neap tides, its phases reflected in the behavior of the sea. And beyond these, the seasons brought their own changes. The arrival of certain migratory birds, the bloom of certain flowers in the dunes, the warming or cooling of the coastal winds. These were calendars of movement, understood not in numbers but in sensations, the smell of the salt air, the particular feel of wet sand underfoot, the tone of the horizon in the evening light. Over millennia, these first coastlines would shift under the slow push and pull of the earth. The sea rose in some places, swallowing old camps and fishing grounds. Elsewhere, it retreated, leaving behind stranded dunes and lagoons that would slowly turn to meadows. In certain rare moments, the change happened quickly. A sudden flood from a melting glacier, a massive earthquake causing the land to sink. These events would have been unforgettable to those who witnessed them. One day, a familiar beach. The next, a bay where no bay had been. And yet, even in the face of such change, the human relationship with the coast endured. The shore was more than a resource. It was a teacher, a guide, a place where the mind could stretch toward the infinite. Standing at the edge of the water, looking out to where the sea met the sky, one could imagine stories of what lay beyond. Lands not yet reached, beings not yet met, and secrets not yet told. The first coastlines may be gone, their shapes altered, their sands scattered, but their memory lingers. It lingers in the stories passed down, in the way we are still drawn to the water, in the way a sunset over the sea can still make us quiet. The line between land and ocean is never truly fixed. It is a meeting place, a breathing place, and perhaps the oldest mirror we have ever looked into. There is a certain quality to the horizon when seen from the edge of the sea, a line that does not waver, no matter the century, no matter the season. It is not a wall, and yet it is a barrier, not a doorway, and yet it feels as though it could open. For millennia, humans have stood where the land gives way to the shifting waters, and they have wondered what lies beyond. The sound of the waves, unhurried and eternal, becomes a rhythm that echoes in the mind. One could almost believe it is the heartbeat of the earth itself, patient and deep, long before the first stone cities rose under the sun. Before empires laid their roads and carved their monuments, there were small gatherings of people, families, clans, who made their lives by the sea. The shore gave food, the water gave movement, the tides gave a kind of calendar. But more than this, the ocean gave a sense of something larger, something older. The endless rolling of the waves hinted at stories already in progress, stories that no human had begun. Across the world, in every culture that has lived near water, there are tales of places that once stood dry and proud above the waves, only to vanish into the depths. These are not only the grand, well-known myths, like Atlantis, with its shining towers, or Lemuria, with its imagined gardens, but also the smaller, more intimate tales. A fishing village swallowed by a sudden swell, a temple taken by the sea after the priests failed to tend the fires, a meadow where children played, now buried beneath silt and coral. Perhaps the most curious thing about these stories is how similar they are, even when told thousands of miles apart. An island people in the Pacific, a coastal tribe in Africa, and a fishing hamlet in northern Europe might never have met, yet each will tell the land being eaten by the sea, of the old ways vanishing under the waves, and of the mysterious silence that follows. It is as though the ocean has been whispering the same message into many ears. Century after century, there is a strange comfort in thinking of the ocean as a keeper of memories. Not a library in the way we know it, with shelves and records and neat labels, but a vast, shifting archive. Its pages are sand and shell. Its ink is the slow staining of time. What it keeps is not easily read. The tide may reveal a fragment, the corner of a pot, the hint of an old wall, before taking it back again. It is a patient archivist, not inclined to reveal everything at once. For the ancient mariners, the ocean was a paradox, both a guide and a danger. They knew its patterns, the swell before a storm, the long pause between certain waves, the feel of the wind as it shifted across the water, and they used these signs to navigate. Yet they also knew that the sea could hide things, even from the most experienced eye. A sudden mist could erase the coastline in moments. A strong current could carry a vessel far from where it was meant to go. And those times one could almost believe the ocean had its own mind, deciding what to show and what to conceal. The horizon itself played into this mystery. From the shore, it was a fixed line. At sea, it was a shifting thing, appearing to move as the ship moved, never truly. Getting closer. This illusion of distance made it the perfect setting for imagination. If you could not reach the horizon, perhaps it was because it belonged to another world, one that existed just out of reach. And perhaps on some quiet night, when the moonlight lay silver on the water, you might catch sight of something, a shape, a glimmer that belonged to that world. Even now, in our time of satellites and oceanographic maps, the sea remains unknowable in certain ways. We can measure its depths, track its currents, map its floor, yet we still find ourselves surprised. New species appear in the nets of deep-sea trawlers. Unexpected ridges and canyons emerge from sonar scans. And always there is the sense that beneath the waves there is more than we have seen, more than we can guess. This is the nature of the timeless horizon. It invites us to look, to wonder, and to listen. If the oceans truly remember, then their memory stretches back beyond. Our oldest ruins, beyond the first marks carved into stone, perhaps even beyond the first human footstep on sand. They have seen lands rise and fall, climates shift, and life reshape itself in ways we cannot yet imagine. They are not in a hurry to tell us everything, but perhaps, if we listen closely, they might let slip a story or two, and so we stand at the shore, as people have always done, watching the meeting place of water and sky. The tide comes in, the tide goes out. A gull wheels above, calling once, before disappearing into the pale distance. The horizon holds steady, patient, as though waiting for us to be ready to understand.